Hello, everybody. I hope you guys are doing great this afternoon. Can everyone hear me okay? Is the volume weird or the audio weird rather? Or volume, but I've been trying to play around with some of the mic settings to make it sound better. Does it sound worse? I'm just trying to get a feel uh for like how it sounds now that I've messed around with it a bit. Today we have a great stream for you guys. First, I want to give a little devotional, and then we're gonna go into story time. I have a great story prepared for you guys. Lots of great detail. Very interesting. It's from a glorious popes talking about Pope Saint Gregory the VII. As we go through these dark times in our church, I think it's very advantageous to reflect on other times in church history when there have been some very dark times, and when all hope seems to be lost. That is right when dawn begins. And so, looking back at our glorious popes, we can see instances when that is the case. I've already kind of talked about Boniface VIII, and so tonight I'll be talking about a similar situation. There's a lot of similarities between what happened with Boniface VIII and Pope Saint Gregory the VII. Sounds good, people saying? Alright, that's good to hear. Alright, first let me read off the gospel passage for this week in the traditional gospel passage, that is. I'm not sure what the Novus Ordo one was, but for the traditional Latin Mass, the Gospel passage for this week read from Luke 19:41 through 47. It says, "At that time, when Jesus drew near to Jerusalem, seeing the city, he wept over it, saying, If thou also hadst known, and that in this thy day, the things that are to thy peace, but now they are hidden from thine eyes. For the days shall come upon thee, and thine enemies shall cast a trench about thee, and compass thee round, and straiten thee on every side, and beat thee flat to the ground, and thy children who are in thee, and they shall not leave in thee a stone upon a stone, because thou hast not known the time of thy visitation. And entering into the temple, he began to cast out them that sold therein, and them that bought, saying to them, It is written, My house is the house of prayer, and you have made it a den of thieves. And he was teaching daily in the temple." The Gospel of the Lord, Laus tibi Christe. And that was from the Gospel of Luke. It's a great gospel there. And this is not my own ideas. These are what the priest said. I attended the Society of St. Pius X chapel on Sunday, and I really liked what he said, applying this verse to Traditionis Custodes and a lot of the things happening right now in our church. And one of the things that he mentioned is we have to walk this tightrope between truth and charity. We have to be charitable. We want to make it clear that as a traditionalist, we are not the rigid meanies that Pope Francis would like to make us out to be, or that Catholic Twitter oftentimes is caricatured as. At the same time, we do not want to compromise on our values either. And so in this verse, we see Christ crying over Jerusalem. He knows that because of the sins of the Jewish people, because Christ knew that the Jewish people would turn against Christ, they would be punished by losing their city, Jerusalem, in 100 AD. The Romans would come and burn down Jerusalem. They would tear down the temple. The only thing left would be the Wailing Wall, which is the only thing left today. You'll see Jewish people and American politicians oftentimes wearing a little kippas as they go down to the Wailing Wall and stick pieces of paper in there. Something like that. It's just a way for politicians to virtue signal, I suppose. In any case. And so we see Jesus, he starts by crying over it. And this is this posture of charity that he's very disappointed with the state of the Jewish people, his people. He is Jewish himself. That was the tribe he was raised in. And so he has a sense of familial connection to the entire ethnic culture. And so he's very upset to see this. He is grieved to see this. But nonetheless, he still routs out these wicked sellers who are trying to exploit the Jewish people in the temple. This is like, just kind of a symptom of this overarching theme in Jewish culture at the time, was pride. That was what caused the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the religious leaders to put Jesus to death. And it was also from pride and greed that these merchants in the temple were trying to exploit people. And that was who Jesus routed out with whips. And in other gospels, it goes into detail. Now, he overturned the tables, made quite a commotion. And so we see Christ exemplifying for us those two virtues. And that really is what virtue is all about, according to Aristotle, is trying to find the bullseye, the means between the two extremes. On one side, you have, on one side you might have too much of a lack of something, and on the other side you have too much of one other thing. And so you have to find temperance. You have to be able to balance the two, find the right balance. Of course, you also have to have a balance of balance. There are some things which are just intrinsically evil, and therefore there can never be the right proportions of murder to not murdering or something like that. But when it comes to truth and charity, you have to find that right balance. It's very difficult, but it's something that we are called to do. Another verse that the priest mentioned, which is kind of relevant to the things happening today, is John 11:50, and it says, this is, by the way, the scribes and the Pharisees, the religious leaders talking here. Neither do you consider that it is expedient for you that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation should perish not. In other words, and they're talking about by that one man, they're speaking of Jesus. And so the context here is that the religious leaders are gathering, and they worry that if they do not get rid of Jesus, he can cause a social upheaval. They see that people are attracted to Jesus because he speaks what is true. As Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and life. And the religious leaders know that what they are teaching is something that is empty and vain, that they have put on, according to Christ, these burdens on the Jewish people that they themselves would not carry through the Talmudic law. And so the Jewish leaders, they want to get rid of Jesus for the sake of trying to, according to them, keep the nation from perishing. They're worried that it'll cause like some revolt, and then the Romans will just wipe out everyone. Which is a bit ironic, since Romans end up doing that. Just that. They wiped out the Jewish nation. But in any case, how is this connected to today? Well, according to the priest, and I think this is quite right, that is what the Latin Mass is. Of course, Christ is contained in the Mass, literally, in the sense that he is there under the guise of bread and wine. And in a sense, also the whole entire Mass is Christ unfolding both his life, his death, his resurrection. All of it is contained there in the liturgy and in the symbols. And it goes back to this sacrifice, and it is the representation, is the clean version of the sacrifice on the cross. It is the same sacrifice in its clean presentation. And for that reason, we should expect that the sacrifice of the Mass, the traditional sacrifice of the Mass, the one that the Church has always used, will be treated much the same way that Christ was. People will be attracted to it, the traditional Mass, traditional Latin Mass. Many people are attracted to it. A lot of young people are attracted to it. And we see that today. And that is why Pope Francis has said that it is better to get rid of the Latin Mass than, according to him, he doesn't want the Novus Ordo Church, the church that is built on Vatican II, the post-conciliar church, the church of accompaniment, the church built on modernism and liberalism. He doesn't want that church to perish. And he knows that with people being attracted to the Latin Mass, it is causing a revival in tradition, a revival in truth. And for that reason, he thinks that it is a most expedient to get rid of the Latin Mass in order to try to preserve this ecumenism and this collegiality that the Church after Vatican II has so desperately tried to maintain. But we know how the story ends. We know how it ends with Christ. He would die, yes, but he would rise again 3 days later into glory, to have a glorified body, start his church, and his church would explode. And despite the persecution of the Romans, it would go on to convert all of Christendom, or all of the West. That was the story of Christianity, and the story of the church will be much similar. Yes, Pope Francis is persecuting it quite heavily at the moment. That is to say, the Latin Mass, which is the fullest and truest expression of our faith contained in the liturgy. But it will survive. It will preserve itself, and the church, the true church, will be given a glorified body and will persevere to the end of the time, as Christ had promised to St. Peter, the gates of hell will never prevail against thee. So that is what we have to look forward to, and just something to keep in mind, that it is not new for people who are afraid and worried that something that is good and something that embodies truth threatens their illusion and their regime, which is built on lies or misconceptions. It is no surprise then that they would want to try to get rid of it and stamp it out. This is not something at all that is new in history. This is something that's gone on for quite some time, and the inevitable result is that truth always wins. Vincit omnia veritas. Truth conquers all things. So thank you. That is all I had to say about the Latin Mass and the Traditionis Custodes. And now I will go into the story time. Let me just get a drink of water there. Alright, so relax, close your eyes, just picture the things that I'm going to be talking about tonight. Just relax, lay down maybe. I'm going to try to make this real visual for you guys here, because this is a great story. A story of a saintly pope and a wicked king, of excommunications, of slaughter, murder, beatings, everything that you could think of in a good story. It's all contained there, and it's all historical. Anti-popes. So let's go back in time to 1073. Pope Alexander III has just died, and a certain monk, a Benedictine monk named Hildebrand, he was a legate for many popes. He was a very devout Christian, very studious. For 6 popes he had worked under, trying to maintain the papal, everyday papal activities. He was a legate for them, like I mentioned. Saint Peter Damian had called him the unmovable pillar of the apostolic see. And so, on this day, in 1073, as I mentioned, Pope Alexander III had just passed, and was laying in the crypt in St. Peter's Basilica. And almost spontaneously, according to the book, according to history, almost spontaneously, as if nothing had caused it, it was just something that was almost organic, miraculous, you could say. This upheaval, this uproar began to ensue amongst the crowds of people surrounding the crypt around Hildebrand, and they began to shout, "Make Hildebrand Pope! Make Hildebrand Pope! Make Hildebrand Pope!" And this is very surprising to him. He had no desire to be Pope. He enjoyed his peaceful life. He wasn't even a priest. He was merely a deacon of the church. That was the highest holy order that he had so far received. And yet the people were chanting, "Make Hildebrand Pope." It was just completely organic, completely miraculous. And the cardinals and the bishops, seeing this sight, they proclaimed, "Saint Peter has spoken. We will make Hildebrand Pope." And so that was the beginning of the papacy for Pope Saint Gregory VII. What a great way to begin his papal office. And so, of course, then he was consecrated as a bishop, and then made a cardinal, and then made Pope. And now, in the reverse side, we see how Pope Gregory was established. In the Holy Roman Empire, Henry IV is made king. Henry IV was made king at only 6 years of age. During this time period, his mother was reigning in his stead. About the time he reached 13, he began to rule himself, and he was known to be a very wicked and unscrupulous king, known to be very decadent and to engage in fornication and degeneracy. He was very greedy. He cared not at all what the church had to say or think. And the Pope knew about this. He was quite aware, and so here's a quote from the Pope to Henry IV, admonishing him for his wickedness. And this is what the Pope says. At the first favorable moment, we mean to express to him, towards the king, through our legates, all a father's watchful love concerning the matters which touch the welfare of the church and honor of his throne. If he listens to us, we shall rejoice in his salvation as in our own, and he can certainly only work out his salvation by following our counsels in the path of justice. But if, God forbid it should happen, he repay with contempt the great mercies God has shown him, our conscience is clear, and sentence, cursed be the man who keeps his sword from blood, will not fall on us. There's very strong words he had there to say to Henry IV, knowing that he was such a wicked king. And Henry IV, surprisingly, he listened to what the king, surprisingly, he listened to what the Pope had to say. And this wasn't because Henry IV actually cared about what the Pope, his Pope's authority, but rather because Henry IV understood that the Pope at the time was the center of Christendom, and that for the Pope to come out publicly and admonish him was a big deal. And he did not want to have conflict with his nobles. He was already getting enough conflict with the noblemen of the Holy Roman Empire. Anyone who understands the politics of the Holy Roman Empire knows that there's a group of nobles, and they each represent various territories, and they get together and elect a king, and this king can be coronated by the Pope as the Emperor of Christendom. That had not yet happened to Henry IV, though we'll see later on how Henry IV wants to become emperor. But in any case, he's always has to contend in this power struggle with these nobles. The nobles care very deeply about what the Pope has to say, and so he writes back to the Pope saying, yes, I'm sorry, I will try to be a good Christian, yada yada yada, in order to just keep his crown, in order to just remain in power. And so, for the time being, he's able to be kept in check, you could say. Now, at the same time, the Pope is also very concerned with simony. Simony is something that we see at the very start of the church. It comes from a man named Simon Magus, or Simon the Magician, and he was someone who had watched St. Peter give out one of the first confirmations, the seal of confirmation through the sacrament, and watching him lay hands, he asked St. Peter if he could have the same power if he gave him some money. In other words, he tries to buy from St. Peter the office of the bishopric. And St. Peter, of course, says that this is not for sale, and since then this has been known as a grave sin called simony. Unfortunately, during periods in the church, simony has been a serious issue, particularly during this time period. Simony was something that the Pope wanted to go to war against, to fight against simony. He wrote many documents condemning simony. He wanted to make it very clear that simony would not be tolerated, that just because you had money does not mean that you could just become that you could be vested, and that you could become a priest or a bishop or even a cardinal, that this was corrupt. And the Pope, who was a very saintly and godly man, wanted to do an end with all these profane practices. And on the other hand, the Pope, another part of his agenda was he wanted to enable a crusade. During his time as simply a legate, he saw and witnessed the great schism of the West. He saw and witnessed the Eastern Church, particularly in Constantinople, the Patriarch in Constantinople, split from the Catholic Church. He saw the great schism, and it was something that greatly bothered him. He wanted to see Christian unity, and he knew that in Syria, the Ottomans, the Muslims, were making it very difficult for pilgrims to visit the Holy Land, and for that reason, he thought of an idea to enact a crusade in order to free pilgrims so that they could visit the Holy Land, and make it also easier for the Byzantine Empire, to reign, so that the Patriarch of Constantinople, seeing the goodwill of Pope Gregory, would rejoin the Catholic Church. This is a very high and noble calling. However, the Pope was never able to call a crusade. because he had too much to deal with at home, unfortunately. Unfortunately, at home, he would encounter his own battle, and so he would never be the one to enact any form of warfare against the Muslims that would come later. And so we have here a special quote from the Pope related to simony that he would actually issue, and that would cause a great deal of controversy. Alrighty. And so in 1074, Pope Gregory had issued a decree condemning simony, like I mentioned, and clerical incontinence, and he received much resistance from that decree, from the nobles and from those who had money, from the Vaishyas, basically, the Third Estate, from those who would like to buy the papal office or buy bishoprics. Those were the people who were pushing back. There was a great deal of corruption. And if you have ever, understood how difficult it is to get rid of, let's say, the mafia or some institutional crime, that was what the Pope was up against. He was trying to push out this institutional corruption, and for that he received a lot of resistance. And for that reason, in 1075, in the February, he released this decree saying, quote, "If anyone in the future accepts from the hand of a layman a bishopric or abbey, he will not be reckoned among the bishops or abbots. We withhold from him the communion of Blessed Peter and entrance into the church, until he renounces the see which he has usurped. Moreover, if any emperor, duke, marquis, count, or any secular power whatever dares to give investiture of a bishopric or other ecclesiastical office, let him know that the same condemnation will fall upon him." Unlike probably most ordinary people who are faced with a great deal of resistance amongst the establishment, the deep state, you might want to call it, unlike that, he stood up against these corrupt forces, and eventually this would basically lead to his death, unfortunately. But in the end, he would be victorious, as you will see. Okay, going back now to Henry IV. So we kind of have to go back and forth between Henry IV and the Pope to kind of get a full understanding of what's going on here. Henry IV, he's always in conflict, like I mentioned, with these nobles. And finally, he's able to kind of sequester them. He's able to corral them into control. He makes it clear that he is the king. He establishes himself as the lawful authority. No one is resisting him anymore. He basically wins that conflict with the nobles. And so now he is more arrogant than ever before. He thinks that he is in control. The nobles have no power against him. And therefore he can do whatever he pleases, including go against the church. And so now we see how Henry IV and the Pope will get into a bit of a conflict. Henry IV, he wants to again secure his own place in the church. He wants to make sure that the church is basically stacked with his guys. And for that reason, he appoints and invests 3 bishops in defiance of Rome, including the Bishop of Milan, who was already canonically invested. He basically tries to replace the person in this very illicit fashion, which is, kind of a big deal. And the Pope, of course, does not like this at all. Once he hears that this is going on, he basically admonishes him once more. He exhorts him that he must repent of what he is doing. He must cease and desist, trying to control the papacy, trying to control the church by trying to invest his own clerics, and and rather than listen to what the Pope has to say, Henry IV does the exact opposite. Again, this is a very arrogant and prideful individual. As we've seen tonight, pride seems to be at the root of almost all sin. And so Henry's answer to the Pope came in 1075 on Christmas Eve. So close your eyes. Now imagine we're in Rome, Christmas Eve, midnight mass, late at night. It's cold out. It's the wind is blowing. It's a cold and dark night. Inside this small chapel, the Pope Gregory VII, is saying mass. to a small group of faithful, not too many people there. He's in the middle of his service, and it is that moment that a large bang, and the doors of the church fly open, and there is the captain of the guard, Sensio, I think is how you saying, Sensio is his name. He comes in, and the Pope, he just stands there in awe. Why would anyone, flabbergasted, why would someone be interrupting him during the middle of Mass? This is Christmas Eve, and the guards come in, and one of them starts to beat the Pope. They strip him of his vestments, and the people, they start to freak out, but there's too little of them to do any real damage. The people attending this chapel, they were too small in number. And so they take the Pope away. He's beaten, he's bruised, he is taken away in chains, and they lock him in a tower. But they locked him in a tower in Rome. And so they stripped him, like I said, of all his vestments. He has been basically, he's been left to look as though he was like a beggar. And this makes the people of Rome very upset the next morning on Christmas Day when they hear that the Christmas present from Henry to Rome was the sequestering of their Pope. And it gets very upset, the people of Rome. They do not take kindly to this, and so they form a mob to get the Pope back, which is very inspiring indeed. And they storm the tower, just using any weapons they can find. These are just lay people. These are not knights or warriors. They find spears, they find lances, they're able to find pitchforks and torches, and they began just banging down the doors. And in the window, and this is reported that one of them sees a guard. He's about to behead Pope Gregory VII. In order, is basically like in order to kind of hold him hostage. They were threatening his life, and then once they see that they're about to be taken over, to be overrun by these lay people, the guard is about to cut off his head, about to behead Pope Gregory. But before he can do that, miraculously, someone in the crowd, an unknown person, throws a lance, and it pierces the side of this guard who is about to behead the Pope. And then according to the person who was writing, it says that this person fell immediately dead, and their soul was forever cast into hell for trying to try to murder a pope. Sensio, the captain of the guard, seeing that his hour has come to die for himself now that the entire tower is overrun, he begs the Pope. He gets on his hands and knees, and he begs the Pope for forgiveness, asking him to spare him from the wild mob. And this is what the Pope says. He says, "I forgive you from my heart, this great and holy Pope," which must have been hard to forgive someone who has literally beaten you and mocked you, locked you in a tower to die. But he says, "Nonetheless, I forgive you from my heart whatever injuries you have done to me, as we ought to as Christians, as Christ says in the Lord's Prayer, we must forgive as God has forgiven us. But you have sinned against God's law," says the Pope, "insulting God's holy mother, and profaned his church, and you must atone for that by a pilgrimage to Jerusalem." In other words, he gives this man a great penance. He gives Sensio a great penance, which is he absolves him of his sins, but he says that he must go to Jerusalem on a pilgrimage. Sensio, of course, one of the themes you'll see tonight is a lot of people who are sorry but are really not sorry. And so Sensio, who really isn't actually that apologetic, he just wants to escape with his life. He slips out of there. From as far as history is concerned, he never went on that pilgrimage, and instead just went back to Henry IV to report on what he saw. As soon as the incident concluded, and the people brought out the papal throne and put the Pope in the papal throne and marched him back to the church. And there at the church, he finished celebrating Mass. There on Christmas Day, he finished celebrating the Mass for the faithful to view. It was a victory for the Pope, it was a victory for Rome. But as soon as that was over, the Pope knew he would have to get down to business. He would have to handle and to deal with Henry IV. He could not just let something like this go unpunished. And so he decided to hold a council, a synod of various bishops in Europe. He decided to do this at the beginning of Lent, and so he tells the king that he is to appear before the Pope at this time. He summons the king, but the king, instead of actually going and because he knows that he's going to be condemned, rather instead he decides to create his own synod, and with the bishops in France, which are all corrupt and are all excuse me, many of them are corrupt. Many of them were invested by the king himself. Many of them were even excommunicated. And so the Henry IV, he starts his own synod, and at this synod, he basically says that he wants to remain in power, and for that reason, he thinks that the Pope cannot be really the Pope. He says that the Pope must be deposed, and so they decide the Pope is deposed. He is no longer a Pope. Which would be ridiculous for a king and a bishop to decide these things. But nonetheless, they that's what they say. They write this really insolent letter, Henry IV does, to the Pope, saying that he's damned forever and that he wants him gone out of Rome. This really insolent thing. And then the Pope, I imagine very enraged by this, he righteously, of course, he creates his own and convenes his own council, and there he excommunicates Henry IV, and this is what he says. And not only does he excommunicate him, he goes even farther, as I will enumerate, but this is what he says. For the honor and defense of thy church, I take away the government of the kingdom of Germany and Italy from King Henry, who, through unparalleled pride, has rebelled against the Holy Church. I release all Christians from their oath of fidelity to him, and I forbid him to be obeyed as king. And because he has scorned to obey as a Christian, spurning the advice I gave him for his salvation, and serving himself from thy church in the attempt to divide it, I, in thy stead, bind him with the bond of anathema. And so he excommunicates and anathematizes Henry IV, and then he releases the basically all the fidelity and loyalty that the people of the Holy Roman Empire, the Germans and Italians, have towards their king. He releases them. This is one in the same stroke, basically. And it is something that if we don't see today, unfortunately, but that how it was in the Middle Ages, as if a king was to act unjustly, contrary to his natural function as the king, the one who is supposed to promote virtue and to promote the common good. If he goes against that, then he is to be judged by the higher caste. He is to be judged by the church. So the church has judged Henry. They judged him anathema, and therefore they judged him as an insubordinate and therefore an invalid leader. And this makes Henry, of course, very upset. He tries to convene with his nobles. He wants to get together with them to see what he can do. And this is very, very suspenseful times, I imagine, for anyone living in Europe. They whisper to each other, did you hear? Did you hear? The gossip begins to, travel amongst all of Christendom. The Pope has just excommunicated a king! A king! The Pope, who has no army to speak of, he has excommunicated and dethroned a king. And so Henry, he tries to convene with the nobles, but the nobles, they are holy men of God, or at least they understand that God is at the center of all Christendom, and they would dare not raise their hand against God's representative on earth, the Holy Pope, and so they do not meet with the Pope. Rather, they do not meet with Henry IV. And instead, they decide to hold their own meeting together, and there, Henry, it says, was at the door knocking. He was knocking, let me in, he knocked many times, trying to get into the meeting, but the nobles would not, they would not let him. They would not let him into the meeting. He was barred from the outside, for as far as they were concerned, he was an illegitimate leader, as he kept knocking and knocking on the door. They continue with their meeting nonetheless. And in their meeting, they discuss what they should do. They wanted to elect a new king to rule the Holy Roman Empire. However, a legate from Rome said, no, wait a year. According to the excommunication, the king has 1 year, and then he will be deposed. He has 1 year to recant, to repent, and if he does not do so, then he must be deposed. So the nobles agreed to meet again in Augsburg this time, and there in Augsburg they decided to have the Pope to be the one who is judging, and they will present what has happened. They will judge Henry, and then if need be, they will elect a new king. Now, Henry, contrary to what he was ordered to do by both the papacy and the nobles, decides to move down towards the Alps. The Pope is on his way to Augsburg this time of the year. It's very cold. It was in the dead of winter. And then he hears that Henry is moving down into the Alps towards where he is located. And the Pope is worried that Henry is coming with vengeance. He is coming with an army to try to kill him. And so he hides in the castle and Canossa, I think is how you say that. And it's in Italy. If you ever look it up, it's a beautiful castle. It's up high in this hill, this crag, a volcanic crag, I believe is what it's called. And it's this castle that's built right on top of a hill. It's almost like Helm's Deep in Lord of the Rings. It's this very fortified edifice. It's not something that can be easily taken down. And so the Pope is there hiding, waiting out to see what Henry will do. And Henry appears at the gate, but he doesn't appear with an army. He appears by himself, and he tries to using some of his family members to intercede for him so that the Pope would release him from this bound of excommunication. And the Pope, he sees what is happening, but he refuses. He says, unless he send up his crown and scepter, I will not release him from the bound of excommunication. He must prove to me that he understands that he is not worthy to be king. And when Henry hears about this, he dresses as a penitent. And he wears this, what I guess you could call a sackcloth, or just this long, very plain looking robe. He wears no shoes. And again, this is the dead of winter. It's snowing out. Close your eyes. Imagine what that would look like. This high tower, this high castle. And there outside is the king dressed in merely just this sackcloth. Very itchy, not something that's very comfortable. No shoes on. And he kneels in the snow and begs for the Pope's mercy. For 1 day he waits and begs for the Pope's mercy. Nothing happens. The Pope doesn't do anything. On day 2, he comes out again and does the exact same thing. There, his feet are freezing. The wind is blowing. I'm sure he is in the utmost pain and misery. This time, people are asking the Pope, please just release him from excommunication. Seeing the king like this in this very humble position, and with him freezing himself in the cold, can't you show some compassion on him? But the Pope refuses to relent. And finally, on the 3rd day, at the very end, seeing this king as he's frozen practically in the snow, his feet without anything covering it, again in this loincloth, or not loincloth, rather the sackcloth, he finally relents. He releases him from excommunication, but he says that I release him from the excommunication, he can now formally rejoin the church, but that does not establish upon him the right to be king again. He is not reinstated as king, rather he is merely he can rejoin the church. And you'd think that for the king to go to this length, to repent in such a profound way, and with humility and with such decency, you would think that he would be very overjoyed to hear that his excommunication had been lifted, but that is not at all the case. Before I go on, let me drop the entropy link real quickly. Oops. Before I go on, quick break. Forgot to drop the entropy link. I have to really remind myself to drop that. So pause in the story. Pause in the story. Oh, now, okay. Drop the entropy link. We'll continue now. The story of a saintly pope and a wicked king. So you would think that the king would be overjoyed to hear that he'd been able to rejoin the church. However, that was never his intent. Similar to the captain of the guard, his intentions were not to be forgiven. Rather, his intention was to be reinstated as king. And it exasperates him to no end that he has not been reinstated as king, and that the conference in Augsburg goes on as planned. And in a show of defiance, Henry refuses to attend this meeting in Augsburg. And so there, at the meeting of Augsburg, Henry is condemned by all of the nobles, with the Pope. The Pope actually was not able to attend. Instead, they had a legate for the Pope. And so Henry was condemned, and he was dethroned, he was deposed of, and in his place, they decide to coronate King Rudolph of Swabia. They decide to make him king. Of course, Henry does not believe that he really is king, and so there's this contention that is happening in the Holy Roman Empire between two kings. Who is the right king? Who is the anti-king? There's this great deal of conflict between trying to understand who has the mandate from heaven, who is the decree from God, the right of God to rule. And at first, the Pope is somewhat neutral, which is a bit surprising. But soon, the Pope makes it clear that he is on Rudolph's side, unsurprisingly. And so he again excommunicates Henry for the final time. And he releases a papal bull that declares that Rudolph is king. And it also declares, as I will now read, let me find it real quickly. And so he tries to depose, Gregory tries to depose King Henry for the last time. And in very stringent words, he says, quote, "If the see of blessed Peter passes judgment on things spiritual, how much more on mere earthly concerns? Let kings and princes now learn what you are and how great is your power, and let them fear to make light of the commands of Holy Church. Exercise your justice against the aforesaid Henry so promptly," and here he is praying to St. Peter, "that no man may attribute to misfortune to mere chance, or rather may attribute to his misfortune to mere chance. And may it please God to lead him by means of misfortunes to repentance, so that in the day of the Lord his soul shall be saved." Very strong words saying, "Saint Peter, please bring misfortune upon this deposed king, so that no man can say it was simply mere chance, but that in truly this man is anathema. He is accursed from God for his disobedience, and may he repent because of that." Unsurprisingly, 2 months after this bull was issued, Henry called another council, and he declared once more that Pope Gregory was not, in fact, Pope. He was a deposed king, rather he was a deposed Pope. He was an anti-Pope, and therefore he chooses one of his own archbishops. He decides that he will now be the new Pope. He chooses his own guy and says, "I want this guy to be Pope." And so then he takes an army and marches into Rome. And a great deal happens during this time. At first, he is not able to get into the inner city, but soon he allies himself with the Emperor of Constantinople. And so he is able to receive a lot of gold and a lot of riches, with which he was able to bribe the people of Rome, bribe the people at the gates, and able to basically loosen their filial loyalty to the Pope. And so they kind of let him just march in. The Pope it basically escapes and it goes into hiding. And so the king then takes over the papacy. The papacy is now occupied. It's a very unfortunate time. And they erect and consecrate Henry's guy. He is Anti-Pope Clement III. And that is the title that he gave himself, Anti-Pope Clement III. And then Anti-Pope Clement III, in order to basically make it clear that Henry is the true Pope, he coronates him the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and basically the emperor of all of Christendom. Of course, none of this is valid, since the people who consecrated him as pope were excommunicated bishops. He is an anti-pope. The true pope escapes. He goes to southern Italy. He flees to southern Italy. This is where he would live out the rest of his life and later die. He is defended there by the King of Normandy. He basically exchanges some of the papal land to the King of Normandy for protection. Some of the army from the King of Normandy that is like charged to retake Rome, they end up actually besieging Rome. Like, they lay Rome to siege, which is actually kind of crazy, and I don't really understand it exactly, but somehow a lot of these post-Viking types, they come into Rome and they're kind of just looking for a fight, and they heard that the Roman people, they had relented to Henry's forces, and so they just lay siege to everything. They kill a lot of the Romans. They kill thousands of them. They sell a lot of them to slavery. Really, it's one of the worst days that the Eternal City has ever faced. Really a dark, dark time for Rome. And then, of course, the Pope is hidden away. And that is where he would retire up in southern Italy in a castle. And what seemed to him like defeat, he thought that he had been defeated. And let me read some quotes from the book here, because I think that they accurately put things in perspective. He is watched as Rome has now been sacked. He is watched as Henry's basically been able to get away with everything. And now he's just basically on house arrest, and where he would later die in southern Italy, in Salerno. And this is where this is the last message that he would read. This is the last message that he would write, and it reads, "The only reason," he wrote, "why the leaders of the nations and the leaders of the priests have armed themselves and come together against Christ and his vicar is this, that we would not keep silent as to the dangers which threaten the Holy Church, nor yield to those who would reduce the bride of Christ to slavery. There are in the world thousands of men who risk death every day at the summons of their lords. Yet when the interests of the King of Heaven, our Redeemer, are at stake, how many Christians shrink, not from death only, but even from the hatred of other men? And the few, thanks be to God for those few, who dare to resist the wicked openly, and to face death, are not only unsupported by their brethren, but are accused by them of imprudence and indiscretion, and are treated as fools. From the day when by the divine will the Church placed me upon the apostolic throne, despite my great unworthiness, and God is my witness, despite my own wish, the one object of all my labors has been that the spouse of God, our mistress and our mother, should recover her ancient glory and become once more free, chaste, and Catholic, because nothing is more hateful than this to our ancient enemy. He has taken up arms. It is to me, though a sinner and unworthy, that the words of the prophet, cry aloud and spare not, have been spoken. Therefore, willing or unwilling, without shame and without fear, without any earthly consideration, I cry perpetually, I cry aloud to announce that the Christian religion, the true faith, which the Son of God, come down from heaven, has taught us by our fathers, is degenerating into mere secular customs, is being lost, falling to nothing, and becoming an object of derision, not only to the demon, but also to the Jews and pagans. If then, like all Christians, you believe St. Peter to be the Prince and Father of all faithful, the chief shepherd after Christ, and the Holy Roman Church to be their mother, I implore and command you, I, your brother and your unworthy master, to come to the help of that Father and that Mother, and thus to merit the absolution of your sins and the blessing and grace of God in this world and the next." Pope Saint Gregory VII would later die in Salerno on May 25th, 1085. just before he died, he would excommunicate all of those he had issue with, umbrage with, except for Henry IV. He was the only one who remained in excommunication until his death. And he received his last sacraments, he received Holy Viaticum, and he spoke his last words. I have loved justice and hated iniquity, therefore I die in exile. Very, very sad. He thought himself a failure. He thought that he had led Christendom into decay as he watched Rome be sacked. He watched it was an anti-pope, or rather an anti-king and an anti-pope take over. But thanks be to God, that was not the end of the story. Even though Gregory would not live to see it, he ended up being the one who would save the church. Later, Henry was forced to abdicate from the throne by his brother, and he would die and excommunicate. Later, the anti-pope, the line of the anti-popes would end, and the Holy Roman Empire would re-recognize the true popes. And this is what the book says about it. I really love the way the book words this here. And Gregory was a very serious pope. He took his faith very seriously. When Rome was being invaded, he was asked to leave, and at first he did not want to. He said, few of us have thus far resisted the wicked to the shedding of blood, and very few have died for Christ. He was willing to die for his faith. And this is the way the book kind of ends this chapter, and I really love the way they explained it, so I'll just read it off word for word. It says, he died thinking himself a failure, but it soon became gloriously clear that Pope St. Gregory VII had saved the Church. After the short pontificate of Pope Victor III, Blessed Pope Urban II, listed among the bishops chosen by Gregory as his possible successor, that was one of the last things he did, is he chose a bunch of bishops to be cardinals and to be his successor, was able to rally Europe to fight the crusade that Pope Gregory had planned and prepared for, but never had been able to accomplish. So Urban, one of the basically descendants of Gregory VII, not a familial descendant, but just from it was one of the bishops that he had chosen, was the one who was able to initiate the Crusades. Likewise, it was out of his suffering and trial that there arose the summit of Catholic culture, which came in the pontificate of Pope Innocent III. Basically, and I'll get to Pope Innocent III in another story time, but Pope Innocent III was probably one of the most glorious popes, one of the most devout popes, and it was because of St. Gregory VII that he made the way, basically, through his condemnation of simony, and through his, basically, his condemnations of these evil, wicked kings. And then eventually he was recognized by Pope Innocent III. The full weight of Christ's church had been placed upon the shoulders of Pope Gregory VII. He had been obliged to fight not only against the mighty ones of the world, but against his own priests and bishops. He had been resisted and attacked and abandoned, yet he had not relented. Quote, the thing I fear above all else, he had said, is to be accused before the supreme judge of having neglected my charge. That is such a great line. He was resisted, and he was under constant turmoil, constant persecution by his own bishops, by people, like I said, it was not, it was these excommunicated bishops in France that had worked with Henry IV in order to undermine the Pope. And so he was being attacked from all four corners, and yet he did not relent. He never gave up. And that is the kind of attitude we have to have. And even though it might seem dark, it might seem real dark right now, we cannot give up. And like Gregory says here, the thing we must fear above all else is to stand accused before the supreme judge of having neglected our charge. And our charge is to be faithful Catholics. Our charge is to teach the faith to our children, to exemplify the faith in charity and in our daily living, to be virtuous and to show the world that we are Christians, not just in the way we talk and the way we live and the way we believe as well. And we have to do that even if it feels like there is no hope. Because in the end, there can be a glorious rebirth as soon as, without even us knowing, after we pass away or whatever might happen. And it could be a glorious rebirth, a glorious refurnishing of the church, a pristination of the church soon after, because of the good things that we have done, because we were saints during this time, through the grace of God, with the help of God, we are able to prepare the way for a new epoch. And the book ends this chapter this way. I love this. Pope St. Gregory VII had been charged with bringing the church through the blackest, most perilous night she had yet endured. And though he himself did not see it, by the time he died, it was dawn. Perhaps by the time we die, it will be dawn as well. Perhaps we'll never get to see dawn, but we know dawn is coming. We can have faith in Christ and have faith that he will not abandon his church, and so we know that dawn is coming, and so we must be like Pope St. Gregory VII and hold fast to what is right, and to never relent, never to give in, regardless of how strong the temporal authority, or even as some of those who are wicked and evil, who have infiltrated the church, want to try to take and strip us from our faith. We can never relent. And like the book so accurately says it, so vividly puts it, dawn is just a few lifetimes away. So thank you guys for listening. That is all I have to say. Yeah, I did the dramatic voice. Yes. Alright, so thank you guys. Let me end the recording here. I'll go in pretty long. So thank you for listening. I'll try to do more. If you guys like these story hour things where I talk about the history of popes, let me know in the comments below. It also helps with the YouTube algorithm, but it also lets me know that I should do more these kinds of streams. So thank you for listening. Make sure to leave a like, make sure to subscribe, do all that good things. And I will see you guys tomorrow.